Greetings, space fans! This is episode 22 of the Dudley Simpson is Doctor Who project, an episode for anyone who enjoys space opera, space wars, interstellar conflict, wars in space, and space. Season 10 began with the celebratory reunion story, The Three Doctors, and as a result of that adventure, the Doctor was finally released from the exile imposed by the Time Lords. With his knowledge of time travel mechanics returned to him, and a new dematerialization circuit for the TARDIS installed, the Doctor resumes his adventures in time and space, accompanied by his loyal assistant, Jo Grant. In the middle of the 1973 season is a pair of 6-episode stories in which the consequences of the first lead directly into the second. This first story provided 2 transcriptions, both of which accompany the same basic scenario. There is a degree of continuity between the two, but not enough for me to turn them into a continuous piece. So, unlike the various suites I've created, these pieces form 2 individual parts called Space Walk. In Frontier in Space, the Doctor and Jo narrowly avoid crashing into a cargo ship by materializing inside it. Finding themselves in the 26th century, they become embroiled in a conflict between Earth and Draconia, home to a race of reptilian humanoids that have maintained a treaty of peace with Earth, albeit uneasily. Yet, all is not as it seems, and the Doctor quickly realizes that a third party is trying to stir up trouble between the 2 planets. Unable to convince the President of Earth that he is not a Draconian agent, he is condemned to the lunar penal colony and separated from Jo. The plot thickens as both Jo and the Doctor are rescued by the Master, the third party. Impersonating a commissioner from a near-independent Earth colony, he locks our heroes in a cell on his ship and blasts off from the moon. Destination, his base of operations on the home world of the Ogrons, his gorilla-like mercenaries. With Jo's help, the Doctor is able to escape from the cell and, donning a protective suit and oxygen tank, goes through an airlock and out of the ship. He plans to spacewalk to another airlock near the bridge where he can take the Master by surprise. Controls on the bridge register that the ship is off course, and as the Master warns his prisoners to hold tight, the ship jerks violently, throwing off the Doctor and hurtling him into open space. The Doctor must think quickly before the ship leaves him behind. Will he survive this course correction? In Season 8, Dudley Simpson composed music, all on synthesizer, for all 25 episodes. In Season 9, although he scored only 14 of 26 episodes that year, he began to add live instruments, like percussion, to his otherwise synthesized scores. Season 10 continued this pattern and is in many ways the first season featuring the Simpson trademark of electronic and acoustic instruments side by side, in roughly equal proportion. We can start to see the evolution of his Doctor Who style more clearly, from the purely acoustic scores of Planet of Giants and The Crusade, to the addition of electric organ in several mid-60s scores, through the electronic dabblings of scores like The Evil of the Daleks and The Seeds of Death, and finally emerging from the early 70s synthesizer revolution into a happy medium. The Frontier in Space score demonstrates this mix, orchestrated with synthesizer, always recorded separately, then integrated with the acoustic performances. Horn, tenor sax, clarinet, and contrabass clarinet, electric piano and organ, mallet percussion, and percussion. Although each instrument type has opportunities for solos or as the lead voice, the music of Spacewalk Course Correction is synthesizer and keyboard driven. As I mentioned, all of this music comes from the middle of episode 4, when the Doctor's plan to spacewalk between airlocks goes horribly awry. The Master's ship makes a sharp course correction, causing the Doctor to lose his grip and float out into space. Knowing the ship could leave him behind at any moment, he must act quickly to get back aboard. Following a brief scene of the Master on the bridge, the music of course correction begins as the Doctor puts his spontaneous plan into action. Almost all of the music underscores a continuous scene where the Doctor disconnects the oxygen tube from his helmet, turns the pressure up to maximum, and uses the force of the expelled gas to push him back to the ship. A second, short clip sees the Doctor successfully enter the airlock and reach safety. Before I begin, I should note a slight musical mystery about these two spacewalk pieces. Neither of them is at 120 beats per minute, which became the Simpsons standard that I discussed in my last episode. I will delve into this curiosity and why this might be in the next episode. The first phrase of this piece is solo electronics, and each of these phrases feature an upper register ostinato made of 4 eighth notes. Together, the 3 pitches that make this ostinato add up to a set of stacked fourths. The lower, an augmented fourth, or tritone. The upper, a perfect fourth. This is notable because of the timbre of the melody. You may recall that when discussing sounds from the Keller Machine theme, I referred to synthesizer timbres, where a melody was harmonizing itself in parallel motion, in thirds, etc. The timbre of this melody is made of the exact structure found in the ostinato, stacked, augmented, and perfect fourths. Once I broke this simple code, it was even simpler to discern the melody in these phrases. However, this is where things get really interesting, arrangement-wise. Another feature of this melody is that as it moves from note to note, or rather sound to sound, the synthesizer slides the pitch from one sound to another. If the notes are only a half step away, you don't notice it. But larger leaps make this pitch sliding very evident, such as ah instead ah. Never one to shy away from a compositional challenge, I experimented with how I could effectively imitate this sliding sound on the piano. The real challenge is that it isn't just one note that's sliding, but the 3 notes of the synthesizer timbre. How do I make it sound like all 3 notes are sliding? With the exception of the widest leaps, I soon hit upon a solution I find very pleasing. I discovered that if I mash my hand down on the keys, but then instantly release everything except the 3-note timbre, the the result is an effective imitation of the pitch-bending synthesizer sound. If you can believe it, the problem wasn't yet completely solved. For now, I had to ask myself an unusual question. How the heck do I write that down in music notation? Although the idea is fairly simple once you explain it, could I find a way of writing it in the score so that it was understandable, even intuitive? I did a little bit of research into what are called extended techniques, involving sounds made by reaching inside the piano, placing objects on the keys to alter the timbre, etc. You may remember that in my episode 11 piece, I plucked a string rather than using the key itself to strike it. I found some examples of extended notation by 20th century composers such as Henry Cowell and George Crumb, and soon settled on a notation I think is as effective and intuitive as I can make it. It does, however, require an asterisk with an explanatory note attached. I should point out that I ended up using a very similar technique and notation for one sound in the Keller Machine suite, but that suite came 2 years after this. Alright, back to the piece itself. In the first 6-bar phrase, the melodic notes can be divided into pairs, each successive one stretching wider than the last. The final 2 bars, seemingly a reiteration of the first bar, concludes with the widest leap yet, ending at F sharp. This ostinato section alternates with a section different from it in almost every way. The musical makeup of this second section is pulsing horn ensemble chords, supported by a percussive, echoing keyboard sound, and accented by the timpani. The actual notes are simple. The horns are playing B-flat, dominant 7th, while the timpani plays a simple 1-5 bass pattern. I imitate the sound by playing these bass notes in octaves, but the higher of the two is played staccato, while the lower is held longer, in deference to the ringing timpani. The tempo of the second section seems to come out of nowhere. It's significantly slower, and the rhythms suggest 6/4 time rather than 4/4 time. There is, in fact, a musical link, for Simpson has performed a metric modulation. When we speak of modulation, we're usually talking about changing keys, E major up to F major, for example. But a metric modulation involves changing the basic pulse without changing a larger sense of tempo. This is what this means in real terms. 2 measures of the 4/4 time from the first section is exactly the same length of time as 1 measure of the 6/4 in the new section. So da da dee da 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 dee da 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 dee da 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 dee da 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 da. If you check out the notation, you'll see a musical equation that indicates the half note length of the 4/4 time is the same length of time as the dotted quarter note of the 6/4 time, which is basically what I just said. After only 2 measures of this section with no melody, we shift back into the ostinato section, this time only a 4-bar phrase. At this point, the synthesizer timbre reveals that not only is it designed to pitch slide from note to note, but it remembers where it was during a pause and slides from where it ended an old phrase to start the new phrase. I reflected this wide slide by a slightly thicker arpeggiation of the last melody note, played by the right hand as if throwing it to the left. This shorter section ends with a truncation of the earlier 2-bar phrase, sliding up to the same F sharp. Like the beginning of the section, I decided to notate the slide specifically, using the simple trick of black keys in the left hand, white keys in the right, to create the blur between the two melodic sounds. Again, we shift without warning to the seemingly slower, horn-driven 6/4 section. After only one measure of this groove, we get an interesting addition. The synthesizer returns to add a melody with a timbre of stacked major thirds, in fact creating augmented triads with its self-harmony. Augmented triads are heard consistently throughout the score of Frontier in Space, and are as connected dramatically with the mysteries of space as they are with the master himself. This augmented addition posed another musical challenge for me in arranging course correction. This melody overlaps with the pulsing of the horns and crosses from one side to the other. Even when excluding the horn's lowest note, I had to calculate how I would use my right hand to do both things. And this sometimes requires me to use my thumb out of order with the rest of my fingers. Whatever works. At least both elements were never impossible to reach. After this augmented melody reaches its conclusion, there is a slight metric modulation again, where the pulse changes from the quarter note of 6/4 time to the dotted quarter note of 6/8 time. The eighth notes, as you see, remain constant. Here, the horn ensemble and electronics join in a set of rising polychords. This reminds me a bit of the juicy chord I spent some time analyzing from the middle of my Bessie suite. But these chords are possibly my favorite so far. Starting on C and rising chromatically up to F, this marvelous harmony is made in 3 clear layers. At the foundation, an augmented triad. In the middle, another augmented triad, a half step lower than the one below it. The top is a falling melodic gesture made of a perfect fourth. This line actually has a third note, but it's doubled by the chord below. As a matter of fact, there is a fourth element here, a swelling synthesizer sound emerging towards the end of this phrase, but there was just no way. To me, these chords are exquisite in their dissonance, precisely because they are made of so many familiar elements, albeit hidden inside. Within the 7 notes are major and minor triads of very different keys simultaneously. In all, they make a giant, threatening sound that only partially resolves when the Doctor has successfully grabbed a hold of the ship. One last time, the piece metrically turns on a dime, back to the ostinato section. The harmony underneath is another strange polychord, B minor underneath, with 2 unrelated augmented triads above that try to resolve, but really don't. The harmony is wide enough that the right hand is required to do a bit of double duty, handling the top notes of the chord as well as the ostinato above. So far, you've heard an uninterrupted flow of music as it was heard in the program. With the Doctor on his way to safety, we cut to a scene on the ship's bridge with totally different music. When we return to the Doctor, he is climbing up a metal ladder on the hull of the ship towards the airlock. This part of the scene is accompanied by different music, and is, in fact, music found in the second part of Spacewalk, which you'll hear in the next episode. It is a little curious, though, why this music needed to be spliced in at this point. Especially because, as we've discussed, Simpson could now compose to the exact second that was needed. Why was it necessary to borrow music meant for episode 6 here in episode 4? This is a question I will also try to address in the next episode. When the Doctor opens the hatch and is at last entering the airlock, the music, with a slightly jarring edit, cuts back to one last phrase of the ostinato section, and in my arrangement, you hear this final phrase without pause. Recalling the initial notes of the opening section, this final melodic phrase drifts up and comes to a halt, with the ostinato coming to rest just afterwards. Thank you very much for watching episode 22 of the Dudley Simpson is Doctor Who project. Like Frontier in Space itself, this episode ends with new questions needing to be addressed. So I guess you better tune in for the next exciting episode. Subscribe, like, share, and comment. See you then.